walk like an Egyptian.
America's first competition talk show.
The hub is engaging.
Talk life.
Waitresses take their trays, spin around, and they cross the floor.
Okay, so Monica is Egyptian, so she is pro-Arabic and anti-Zionist, and
That is
Barry
not
wrote
true.
a column on why Israel should nuke Iran, and so Barry is a Zionist, and he's. I don't know how you get up. I mean, I read this column, Barry. You're like Winston Churchill II. You really are. This is like Allah versus Yahweh. It's pay-per-view, but good for all of us. You can now get it on cable. Egypt, Israel, and the Middle East. You just geopoliticked to your little heart's content with this column. This was fun stuff.
Yeah, I was just having a beer and bored one night and what the heck.
Why not do some research?
Watching too much CNN and what's his name out over in Egypt getting beat up on the camera.
But you're
Anderson Cooper?
Yeah, that guy.
But you just said, I mean, ultimately, and you kind of took it to, I think, to an extreme over what a lot of folks are saying. But let's war game it a bit, because you were saying in your column that should Mubarak fall and the current regime in Egypt that has been in power for decades now and be replaced by something, a theocratic regime like the Muslim Brotherhood, very quickly Israel would be forced to respond to the Iranian nuclear threat.
Well, what I said, and I didn't say Israel should nuke Iran. I said I think Israel will nuke Iran. And
much to your chagrin, right?
So
you're not a
I think it would be
Zionist.
terrible for the United States.
Okay.
This would be devastating here. But the reason is Israel's had their southern border secure for the last 30 years with Egypt and the peace treaty and so on. So they really haven't had to worry about that. And Egypt has a very powerful military. They've got 80 million people there. It's a very powerful country, but they've had peace with them for 30 years. Now you've got the risk that could go away. You've got a risk that that's a potential threat. Iran is developing nuclear weapons, allegedly. And
we've been allegedly developing them for decades.
And the reason
but we
why
allegedly won't let the IAEA figure it out.
So the reason why this comes
cat
into
and mouse
play
game.
and becomes much more important is it's a concern for Israel to begin with. But if you say now there is an extremely powerful conventional military force on their border, it becomes more critical that they stop Iran from having nuclear weapons that could potentially offset their own nuclear deterrent against a conventional force.
So in other words, they're sandwiched in between what is now what used to be an ally in Egypt, which would now quickly become a hostile situation with a nuclear ambition on one side of the situation. Then on the north, you've got Iran, which are obviously anti-Israeli, would like to wipe them off the face of the map, and they have been going for it for a long time as well. So in other words, you create a no-win situation for Israel.
Well, Iran is further away.
Eye of the storm.
It becomes much more complicated having a conventional force next to them. But the reason why I think they would nuke Iran is because I don't see any other way that they're going to stop developing nuclear weapons. There isn't a reactor to go hit. The U.S. is not going to invade Iran. We don't have the forces. We don't have the desire.
We don't have the
It's
will
not gonna
right now, I
happen.
think,
No,
more
we
than
don't have
anything
the
else.
will.
Now, I'm going to throw one to Monica because, honestly, all of this, I think, some of it presupposes that the regime that would replace the current, it's non-democratic, but the current regime in Egypt under Mubarak, would be something akin to the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a theocratic regime which in the past has been tied to terrorist activities. Number two man in Al-Qaeda. They've supposedly cleaned themselves up now. But all of this presupposes they would be the ones to rush in and be the new regime in power. And I refuse to think that. I've spoken to folks that live in Egypt right now or live around it, and they say it's a little more complicated than the U.S. media has been putting out because the Muslim Brotherhood makes up, according to the statistics I pulled on the most recent elections, 2% of the government in the region. Barry says closer to 20%, and but the bottom line is right at 80% is controlled by Mubarak's regime right now and the military they have in place. So I guess my question is, Is it a foregone conclusion that if he steps down or is removed from power, it's going to be some group like the Muslim Brotherhood stepping in?
Well, first off, the elections, I think Mubarak got 99% of the vote, so
He's
very
I agree.
popular.
Yeah.
Right, so popular.
Clearly.
Everybody loves him. That's exactly why he.
Especially the women walking around fully covered going, this is just swell. Love
I don't
it.
really think that's because of Mubarak. I think,
No, it has, yeah.
Um,
He's pretty secular.
right. As secular as you can be, but
Very secular. Okay. He's Saddam Hussein in that respect. Anyway, go on.
So, yeah, I think it's a very fair possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood would take power. I know the media, they're saying that that wouldn't happen, but I don't really know who else would.
Well, some are, some aren't, and I mean they've certainly established a Supreme Council of the party, 45 members of that, different entities within, 15 committee secretaries, one who just recently stepped down. There's a governing, and you go into this in your column, Bear. There's a governing structure in Egypt that has basically accommodated for. Goodness, before we set up this regime, Egypt was very unstable and very anti-Israeli, and everybody remembers back to the 6 Days War when it was a kind of a cabal between them and Syria and Jordan, and all kind of came together to converge against Israel back in the 60s. So he's providing for that. He's saying, okay, we're going to hedge against that, but you think the hedge is not stable.
No, I don't. I think that the analogy is what happened in the Palestinian territories, where they had an election that was fair, free, democratic, internationally supervised, and it was between Fatah, which was corrupt, and Hamas, which was viewed as being not corrupt and being socially helpful, and so they won in an election. And I think in Egypt, you're going to have essentially the NDP crowd versus the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be viewed as not corrupt, not the NDP, or Mubarak's party, and they do a lot of social work. So I think they're going to be very popular. They have a structure in place. They have a lot of people in place, and I would agree with Monica that there really isn't another organized group in there. So if you're planning on having an election anytime soon, it's most likely going to be the Muslim Brotherhood that is going to win that.
Well, and you said, and honestly, I know that, I mean, if we have a warmongering type scenario, which is what we could have in this type of situation, it's going to mess with the Shabbat curfews for sure. It's going to play hell for Saturdays, excuse me. But in Israel anyway. But the thing is, you wrote in the column that you're concerned that Egypt would be more willing in this type of scenario to form an alliance with Iran now as a nuclear deterrent, since Iran has nuclear aspirations. I honestly don't know why. I mean, to defend against Israel. If Israel had wanted to fire upon any one of these nations up to this point, they've had nuclear military power for a long time. If they were looking to, they haven't had to. They haven't, because they already have that deterrent. So if they were a hostile nation to these regimes on a large level, on a wipe you off the face of the earth kind of level, they would have done this already. So to use that whole, we need this alliance established to form a deterrent against Israel, I think it's a farcical argument, because they would have needed it already. Israel has not engaged in that for all the obvious reasons, and I don't know why they would now, except unless, of course, I don't know, a nuclear deterrent is needed on the part of Israel.
Well, again, I'll go back to Iran, that there isn't I don't see another way of Israel stopping Iran from developing nuclear weapons. And the risk is that Iran could say, hey, we're going to put a nuclear umbrella over Egypt. And then if Egypt wanted to have another conflict, and they've had three with Israel in 48, 67, and 73 prior to the peace treaty, the Muslim Brotherhood has openly said they do not support the peace treaty. They've openly said we need to get rid of this. So it's
Well, you put in your column, Monica, comment?
If I'm not mistaken, Nasser was leading, and the Muslim Brotherhood, a lot of them were actually in jail when those conflicts happened. So I wonder if that would be a factor. I don't know, but that's just something to consider as well.
Yeah, they just didn't have the
but
chance.
I'm telling you
If
that
they'd
now.
have had some power on the world stage, it's really
Right.
hard to act when they don't cast you in the role. When you're confined backstage. You put in your column though that this kind of a situation in Egypt, them falling, the current regime falling, would drive the Iranians to accelerate their efforts to become nuclear armed, since having nuclear weapons would reduce an adversary's willingness to launch conventional attacks against them. I'm sure Russia will play the RA now, with Iran, because we gave them the United Kingdom's nuclear weapons code, so that should be a deterrent, right? I mean,
Well, that's where you get into, and actually part of what I said in the article was that if Israel were to have a nuke against Iran, you could see other Middle Eastern countries look for a protection and align with another country like China instead of the United States, because the U.S. is clearly not going to protect them from Israel, and so that could be the big risk.
You wrote down in the column the public desire in the U.S. is to end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan rather than launch a new preemptive war in a much larger and militarily stronger country. So the only way to stop the Iranians from developing nuclear weapons is to do something that would cause them to stop developing them on their own. So basically, we could develop them for them and then sell them to them at fire sale prices. That would also stop them from developing it
somebody
further
could
on
give
their own.
that to them
I mean,
too.
if it's really all about stopping them
Yeah.
from developing it,
I
there are
hate
other
to say
ways.
it, but it would actually be safer if they just set one off, because then it's like it's like North Korea. You're less likely to say, "Oh, let's go attack North Korea," when they're setting off nuclear
Well,
weapons.
the point is, if everybody's fighting over the same sand in the sandbox, the best solution is just to turn the sand to glass.
This is what's changing, because if you look, the only really substantial military force that is within striking distance of Israel is Egypt. And they've had a peace treaty for 30 years that's been, you can call it a cold peace, you can call it what it is, but it's been peace, and there hasn't been a threat. Now it's like you're talking about changing the government to one that could be unfriendly to Israel. And really what you have to do is the threat is defined not by whether the government is friendly to you or not, but by what is the military capability of the government. And you only have to look at Iran and what happened during Carter, because Iran had been our strongest ally in that part of the world, and sort of the Central Asia / Middle East area, and then it turned overnight.
Yeah, the Shah was deposed, and it took, and it was honestly, he was deposed by radical college students in a lot of cases, similar to what we're seeing in Egypt right now. They keep disappearing, by the way, all these youth groups. But, I mean, these groups kind of, the whole thing fell apart overnight, and they thought they were fighting for a true democracy. What they got was a theocratic dictatorship.
It's sort of fascinating. There's an article by Jean Kirkpatrick on dictators and diplomacy, or anyway, she really talks about Carter and Iran and communism, and it's really applicable if you do a global search and replace to Egypt and Obama and radical Islam today. And you have the same things. People go in there and they think, oh, it's going to be democratic, and then it doesn't necessarily work out that way. And so I think that's the risk from an Israel perspective.
So set aside the fact that you believe, the nuclear deterrent would cause some of these Arab nations to ally with each other. Set aside the fact that I thought that was what Allah was for. The deterrent factor. Say the wheels on the bus come off. Okay. Very quickly, Israel becomes more hostile because they feel the necessity toward Iran. To kind of war game it the way you did, the geopolitics. Egypt very quickly forms an alliance with Iran. All of the Arab nations are looking for a big ally, because the assumption would be that the U.S. would ally with Israel, or at least support them. I think that's a big assumption at this current point right now. The court of public opinion is one thing. What the administration would do, it's totally different. But ultimately, they're going to be looking for a new big brother alibi. You see that coming from China. You see the entire structure, allied structure, shifting to be anti-U.S., anti-Israeli.
I think, in my argument, if Israel were to drop a nuke on Iran to get them to stop their nuclear program, every other country in the Middle East, all the Arab countries, are going to be going ballistic. And they're going to be saying, okay, this could happen to us, and what's going to stop it? Because the U.S. is not going to stop Israel. They're going to go and they're going to say, hey, nobody in the world can do anything to stop them. They did the right thing, yada, yada, yada.
I'll tell you what'll stop
So
it.
if I'm an Arab country, I'm going to say, who's going to protect me from the same thing happening to that? And I'm going to be looking, okay, who else has nukes? Who else is big? China has nukes. They're big. They need energy. They could realign with China as a partner, and China, because it puts up, you don't know what China's going to do, but it puts up uncertainty, and there is no uncertainty if the Arab countries are aligned with.
But see, we have too many things on our side. I mean, let's count them. We have McDonald's, Coca-Cola. We have Mr. Rogers. All worldwide respected icons. I mean,
Mr. Rogers is dead. You know how much Coke and McDonald's they have in China now? It's like I have a good friend who is.
But they know where it came from, and they
have plants over there now.
Eternally indebted to us, I believe. I think solve the world problems, corporatocracy. That'll be it. Monica, last word, the female perspective on all this.
Who did the peace treaty?
And that's the wisdom we're looking for, the sage of the
President
panel.
Carter. That's all I have to say between Egypt and Israel.
Oh, and he's a Sunday school teacher. If he had just stayed there, we'd all be better off. We'll see you tomorrow on The Hub.